If you know Friday the 13th for anything, it's Jason Voorhees. A hockey-masked force of terror picking off teens one by one, Jason has become easily the most enduring cultural element of the Friday films, known by hardcore fans and outside observers alike. For many, myself included, he's the go-to slasher icon, and even with the Friday franchise trapped in developmental purgatory for the past decade plus, Jason still endures, making it all the more surprising that, for me, the best villainous turn in the Friday films doesn't come from Jason at all.
Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
If you'll allow me to spoil the almost 50-year-old film that kicked this franchise off, the original killer in Friday the 13th wasn't Jason, but instead, his mother, Pamela Voorhees, made vengeful after the drowning of her son years before, while camp counselors were off being teenagers. And look, there are many reasons I love the sinister turn here for Jason's mother. For one, the performance of her character, done by the late, great Betsy Palmer, is miles ahead of almost anything else in the Friday films. Paired with some of the most dull, forgettable characters of the entire franchise, Pamela sticks out like a sore thumb in the best of ways, with a strong emotional core that easily draws out audience sympathy. I also appreciate her appearance for how it ignites the powder keg of tension built across this initial Friday movie. Every slow, methodical moment in this quite low-budget film feels worth it when Pamela appears. Everything suddenly going off in tandem for a clear third act peak that feels oh so satisfying. But what really elevates Pamela here and makes the appearance of her character a shining moment for the Friday series is how it completely spits in the face of slasher convention and breaks the genre, setting the stage for a supremely weird and fascinating franchise to follow, what I want to discuss today. So settle in, my beautiful campers, as we talk about gender, film theory, and Friday the 13th. To understand what exactly makes the Pamela twist in the original Friday so unique and groundbreaking, you first have to understand a little bit about the slasher film and the academic literature behind it, which is really to say, you need to read this book. Men, Women, and Chainsaws is a must-have for any horror fan, a collection of writings on gender in the slasher by Carol J. Clover, who, along with scholars such as Robin Wood, helped develop a real academic lens of understanding horror cinema, a genre often labeled as unworthy of such critical analysis during the time of Clover's work. For our purposes today, I would direct you to Chapter 1, Her Body Himself, a neat and fairly short dive into the gender politics of the slasher film. Movies that commonly follow a singular villain picking off a cast of disposable characters one by one. Other chapters get into possession horror and revenge cinema. All of them are worth your attention. This is a great book, but for today's purposes, we're sticking pretty closely to just this first section of the novel. Her Body Himself might be most notable for first coining the term final girl. If you're an ardent horror fan, that's likely something you've heard before. It's certainly escaped the bounds of this novel and grown into a common horror term. But for those unfamiliar, Clover's final girl is essentially an archetype. In the vast majority of slashers, for whatever reason, we commonly find one character surviving the story. Not the villain, but one of our leads, very often a woman. Final boys do exist, see Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Evil Dead, or later Friday films, but final girls truly are the norm. Think of the second most popular character from any major horror franchise, and chances are you probably have the final girl. Right under Michael Myers, there's Laurie Strode, under Freddy Krueger, there's Nancy Thompson, and under the Alien, which is honestly a slasher, there's Ellen Ripley. While Clover could easily just link these characters together based on their status as survivors, she pushes further, developing a comprehensive portrait of the common final girl through a variety of attributes she often possesses. Final girls are typically modest, non-sexual virgins, somewhat androgynous, oftentimes down to their names, who follow fairly predictable arcs of going from scared damsels to active heroines. That's certainly an oddly specific set of attributes to see appear across multiple characters in slasher films, and we'll circle back to what the significance of those shared traits implies in Clover's view momentarily. But before we get to that, let's discuss another just as important archetype which Clover talks about in this chapter, that of the slasher villain. As she does with Final Girls, Clover outlines some key traits shared by most slasher villains in this chapter, framing them as often sexually repressed males, usually burdened by childhood trauma, commonly infantile in nature or stuck in some state of arrested development, who wield phallic weapons of carnage and prey on women. Again, these are oddly specific traits to see crop up for multiple characters across films. So, what does Clover make of these traits in the archetypes of feminine slasher hero and male slasher villain? Well, Clover's theory goes roughly as follows. Both Final Girl and slasher antagonist are stuck in a similar spot, commonly on the threshold of childhood, conventionally coded as feminine, and adulthood, conventionally associated with masculine agency. Now, I'll say up front, I don't enjoy the implications of that dichotomy. It's one, very much rooted in a rigid gender binary, and two, supposes that femininity is inherently childish or passive, both things I don't support. But Clover isn't so much endorsing those concepts here as she is accepting them as unfortunate facts of media history. In our modern day, we can see that these means of viewing gender are inherently limiting and sexist, but it's impossible to deny the history of limiting and sexist representation of gender in film and popular media overall. This video is less about determining if the gender politics of slashers are empowering. That's something I might be circling back to next video, but I wanted to mention that because I know many of you will be rightfully upset with the way gender is handled in the slasher film and what I kind of base my analysis on here. That being said, back to Clover's theory. The Final Girl is obviously feminine in the fact that she's a woman and often presented as young, something conventionally associated with femininity, yet she's also a fair bit masculine. As Clover writes, quote, her smartness, gravity, competence in mechanical and other practical matters, and sexual reluctance set her apart from the other girls and ally her, ironically, with the very boys she fears or rejects, not to speak of the killer himself, end quote. She is trapped between the male and the female, between childhood and adulthood, and so too is the slasher villain. A typical slasher, and almost an exact inverse of the Final Girl, is male, but decidedly feminine in his actions and social status. Where the strong male is commonly attractive, confident, sexually comfortable, and fully an adult, the slasher villain is widely the opposite. Hiding their physical appearance behind a mask, acting incredibly antisocial, brandishing phallic weapons that highlight their impotence, and in one manner or another, presenting as infantile. Think of Texas Chainsaw's own Leatherface, portrayed as childlike, wielding a massive chainsaw and briefly presenting as feminine, or Halloween's Michael Myers, forever associated with his child portrayal at the start of the film, punishing sexuality, and wielding a large kitchen knife. Or perhaps the original slasher villain, Psycho's Norman Bates, framed as childlike under the thumb of his mother, feminine in his assuming of her identity, and also brandishing a signature knife with which he enacts violent penetration onto women. And so the slasher villain becomes a dark mirror to the Final Girl, and a cautionary portrait of who she might become if her journey into masculine adulthood cannot be realized. It follows that, for Clover, the story of the average slasher film is a coming-of-age one, where the feminine childhood, often violently, is left behind for the masculine adulthood. Again, in the words of Clover, by the end of the slasher film, quote, the Final Girl has not just manned herself, she specifically unmans an oppressor whose masculinity was in question to begin with. And later, quote, when the Final Girl stands at last in the light of day with a knife in her hand, she has delivered herself into the adult world, end quote. There's, of course, more to it. I mean, the woman wrote a whole amazing book about gender in the horror film, and I gave you like 3 quotes, but I wanted to provide that rough outline of Clover's interpretation, mostly because it's the most common academic framework to view the slasher film through. It gives us an actual means of finding the message in most slasher movies, and helps us to pull deeper meanings from them beyond all the boobs and blood. I also mentioned Clover's framework because the original Friday the 13th, and by proxy the rest of the series, defies it almost completely. As I already told y'all, Pamela Voorhees, a middle-aged mother, is revealed to be the killer in the original Friday, which makes very little sense if you subscribe to Clover's interpretation of the slasher. For 90% of Friday Part 1, we're led to assume the villain is a man. Every POV shot of the killer highlights their masculine clothes, they prey on women in a manner conventionally associated with male slasher killers, and they achieve feats that it would seem impossible for most women to. I still don't believe that Betsy Palmer can throw a body through a window, and the film explicitly tells us she did that. But in the final 10% of the film, the appearance of Pamela complicates everything. Where we could have easily gotten an archetypal story of male killer and final girl, we're met instead with a conflict between final girl and older woman, who enacts violence out of a desire for revenge after her young son fell victim to counselor negligence. So what do we make of this? Well, Clover, for what it's worth, actually addresses the original Friday the 13th briefly in her novel, implying that Pamela Voorhees has just assumed the identity of Jason in a kind of inversion of the Psycho twist, where male killer Norman Bates takes on the identity of his mother. This is best signified in the scenes where Pamela echoes the voice of her son, Clover implying that she is therefore channeling a male slasher killer, one who fits all the conventional tropes. Eternal child, sexually repressed, conventionally unattractive, etc.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
And while that theory is strong, I would say this is the point where I disagree with Clover, and branch off from her filmic analysis of the slasher into one of my own, special made for the Friday movies. So welcome to Ellie Film Theory. We have a lot to cover, so I'm glad y'all can make it. First off, why do I disagree with Clover? Her analysis of Pamela as an extension of Jason seems to fit neatly within the text of the film and makes the Friday movies fit into a pre-established slasher framework that makes sense. Well, I diverge in my interpretation mostly because I'm annoying. No, I actually disagree because I don't think that's what the text of the film tells us, at all. Pamela does assume Jason's identity briefly in the original Friday, but we see clearly that her motivation to kill is one born out of her status as a mother and the pain of losing her child. She channels Jason, but it's a Jason encouraging her to enact the revenge she's already bent on. This isn't a Psycho-style case where Pamela is literally acting as her son. This is a totally separate thing, Pamela getting revenge out of her own free will and as herself. So if Pamela doesn't represent a character stuck between childhood and adulthood, the feminine and the masculine, like the final girl, then what does she represent? And what implication does that bring to the narrative? Well, my theory about the first Friday is this. Pamela Voorhees is not some embodiment of Jason and the slasher villain at large, but rather an embodiment of the overprotective mother made manifest. Her story delivering a similar message to other slasher films about adulthood, but in a radically different manner from other slasher cinema. Pamela is not a mirror to Alice, our final girl here, in the same way a Michael Myers or a Leatherface might be. And truly, how could she be? Maybe you could argue Pamela is stuck between the male and the female due to her implied male identity for so much of this movie, but Pamela is a grown woman, clearly not stuck in arrested development, and therefore not representing the same type of cautionary tale that most slasher antagonists do for the final girl. She is rather a fixture of adulthood already, and therefore represents, to Alice, an image of the overbearing parent, making clear the coming-of-age narrative here, one that's often presented more subtly in other slasher films. Notably, Pamela's actions here are motivated by the loss of Jason as a consequence of camp counselors engaging in sexual activity. A lot of people talk about the trope of sex equating death in Friday films, but it's important to hone in on this formative moment for Pamela as the point from which that trope flows, because it tells us a lot about Pamela's role as an antagonist here. Sexuality represents something distinctly adult in nature. In common culture, initial sexuality marks overtly the transition into adulthood from childhood, and it's something Pamela is outwardly against in this film. In Pamela's view, sexuality, and by proxy the abandoning of childhood, can only bring harm. And so she deems teenage sexuality as a punishable offense, targeting characters in this film who either explicitly or through implication from the camera engage in sexuality. The eternal child status of Jason, who normally would be the archetypal killer, comes not so much to define his character, but to inform Pamela's. The light of her world, her only child, was not only taken from her by teenage sexuality, but represents himself the type of childhood innocence that Pamela seeks to maintain at all cost. In other slasher films, sexuality often spells death for similar reasons, because it represents growing up and moving into adulthood. But where those films see a male killer who can't grow, violently denying others that same growth, here the context is different. Pamela becomes this kind of gatekeeper for adulthood, someone who already inhabits an adult space, yet refuses to let others, particularly women, come into their own adult status. So Alice's struggle here is one seen in other slasher films, yes, the struggle to become an adult, but the person she struggles against is not so much a mirror image of herself, a character we might read as a personification of teen insecurities and fears over growing up, but an embodiment of the repressive parent. making the struggle of this first Friday much more external than internal. Final girls often clash with themselves in a sense, their internal conflicts being embodied through the villain. But in Friday, Alice is clashing against a representation of her mother, telling her that she's not allowed to become an adult due to the harm it will cause, that she must forever remain a child or suffer her wrath. And so I hear you asking, okay, that makes sense, cool theory, I guess.
God, what's next?
But what does it actually matter? If this change to the slasher formula leaves us with basically the same message about growing up and abandoning feminine coded childhood for masculine coded adulthood, albeit in a different way, why should we even care? The answer is twofold. First of all, it makes this first Friday movie very interesting. Unlike other slasher franchises, the first film in the Friday series is not all that acclaimed. Where the original Nightmare on Elm Street or Child's Play films are beloved classics of horror, the original Friday is often written off as derivative trash. But understanding the film through a lens of gender analysis, I think the importance of this first movie grows. Friday is a series defined by and in the 1980s, an era of increasing conservatism and parental values. It's the era of Thatcher and Reagan, of satanic panic and house hearings on what content should be allowed in popular art. So it's fitting that this first Friday film would, almost more than any other slasher film out there, highlight a rebellious and sexually empowered youth coming into conflict with a direct manifestation of their parents. Pamela's character leaves little to the imagination. She is a Reagan-like figure, a Thatcher-like figure, from a time where both of those politicians were just reaching the height of their influence. And I find that so interesting. It makes the original Friday into one of the most progressive and proudly anti-conservative slasher movies from this time, and it leads me to respect this film so much more than most do, regardless of if that commentary was intentional or not. But I said my reasons were twofold, so what's the second fold? I'm happy you asked. If only this original Friday film broke the normal gender molds of the slasher, then I would find that quite cool. But what really pushed me to make this video and dive so deeply into the first Friday film is the fact that what's done here with the character of Pamela Voorhees, what she represents, well, it has repercussions for the rest of the Friday series, delivering onto us a serious through line of commentary across the various Friday sequels to come. How do those repercussions appear? Do I think their positive attributes outweigh some of the more limiting aspects of these films? Is Friday the 13th truly for the girls? Join me as I answer all of it starting right now. I'm about to discuss everything we've learned so far and apply it to the very hit or miss Friday the 13th franchise. Hello? Surprise. It was me. I was the killer all along. Anticlimactic, I know. But you know, we're a one-woman operation here, so I didn't really have like anyone else to help me with this. Yeah, so I was actually evil the whole time. I hope y'all love that twist because it's the most entertaining thing I will do probably this year. I'm basically here just at the end to say thank y'all for watching the video, as I always do at the end of my videos. I am super excited to be covering Friday the 13th. These are some of my all-time favorite horror movies and perfect summer films, so I figured this was as good a time as any to talk about them, and I hope y'all thought I had some interesting ideas to share about this first Friday film, and I hope you'll come back next time when I talk about the rest of them. As should be expected, my biggest thank you goes out to my patrons. Y'all are literally what keeps this channel alive. Your monetary support allows me to make videos and take risk, and I just really appreciate that. And a very special shout out is going to go to my patrons in the shout out tiers. Special thanks to Gabrielle H, Alex C, Mig D, Jake Eckenrode, Anya May, Onyx, Sophie Villarot, Adrian_R31, Alex Mirabal, and Grace. Always Myth Taken and Brooks Bailey too. Like I already said, we're back next week with a follow-up video talking about the rest of the Friday franchise. For now though, as always, I have been Ellie, you have been wonderful, and until next time, bye! Bro, I can't get it off. This is just my life now.
Good night.